Historians estimate that between the 15th and 17th centuries, Crimean Tatar raiders carried off more than 1 million people from the villages of Ukraine, Poland and Muscovy. Most of them were women. They left their homes roped together and almost none ever came back. This is not the story of the raids. It is the story of what the raids were actually for. The march, the market, the household at the end of the road. The system that turned a person into property step by step, and exactly what each step looked like. Roped together and driven across the empty steppe. The raids came fast, that was the point. Crimean Tatar cavalry could cover enormous distances before any organized response had time to form. They struck at night or at the first grey light of dawn, burned what they couldn't carry, and were moving again before midday. The killing was selective. Dead people couldn't be sold. What they took with them was called yasir, a word that meant both the act of capture and the captives themselves. And the yasir column moved immediately, because every hour of delay narrowed the margin between profit and pursuit. Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, a French military engineer who spent over a decade in the Polish-Lithuanian borderlands in the 1630s and 1640s, documented these columns in his account of Ukraine. Women and men were harshly tethered together, he wrote, forced to walk barefoot across terrain that horses crossed without slowing. Those who stumbled were dragged. Those who could not continue were killed and left. There was no room in the calculation for anything else. The march could last weeks. The destination was the Crimean Peninsula, and specifically the port city of Kaffa on the peninsula's southern coast. Known today as Feodosia, Kaffa was one of the most active slave markets in the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Under the Genoese, it had processed thousands annually. Under Ottoman control after 1475, the scale only grew. Sigismund von Herberstein, the Habsburg diplomat who travelled extensively through Muscovy in the early 16th century and recorded what he found in his Rerum Moscoviticarum Commentari, described the trade routes converging on Kaffa as functioning like a commercial circuit, regular, organised, and built into the economic logic of the region. The raiders were not disorganised men of violence. They were suppliers in a system that had buyers at the other end. Women of childbearing age were the most commercially valuable part of that system. That determined how they were treated on the march, kept alive deliberately, fed just enough to keep moving, watched closely. Escape was a financial loss, and it was treated as one. But it wasn't just the guards that made escape almost inconceivable. The steppe itself did that work. A woman who had never travelled more than a few miles from her birth village now found herself walking east or south across hundreds of miles of open grassland, in a direction she couldn't name, surrounded by men whose language she didn't speak. There were no landmarks she recognized, no roads leading home, no one she could call to. The geography was its own kind of chain, and it held tighter than rope. The march broke the physical connection to home. By the time the columns reached the slave camps outside Kaffa, the women who had survived it were already somewhere between two worlds, no longer part of the one they had left, not yet assigned to the one ahead. That transition was about to become official. Stripped of name, family, and status at the slave camp. Kaffa was not operating in secret. It was visible, busy, and recognized by every major commercial power with interests in the Black Sea. Merchants from Istanbul, Venice, Genoa, and Persia all knew where to find it and what it sold. When a column of yasir arrived, the sorting began quickly. Captives were assessed with commercial directness: age, health, apparent capability, physical condition. Prices were set accordingly. What happened next was deliberate. Families were separated, mothers from daughters, siblings from each other. Any bonds that had survived the march were cut here, at the point of sale. This was not incidental. Buyers wanted individuals, not clusters of people with emotional ties to one another. Emotional ties complicated ownership. Women were assigned new names, not always on the first day, but the process was consistent. A Ruthenian or Polish name had no currency in an Ottoman household. The renaming was part of a larger Eurasia, of language, of origin, of legal standing. Under Ottoman law, an enslaved person had no recognized family relationships. Whatever had existed before the raid ceased to exist the moment a bill of sale changed hands. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar and traveller who passed through Golden Horde territory in the 1330s and left detailed observations of the steppe world, described slave markets operating across the region with striking commercial maturity. Captives sorted by origin and skill, priced with precision, transported along established routes by professional traders. The Kaffa operation 2 centuries later was a more specialized, more industrial version of the same structure. The logic was identical. Marcin Broniewski, a Polish envoy who traveled to the Crimea in the 1590s and documented what he witnessed in his Tartaria Descriptio, described the Kaffa market with visible disgust. Women were examined openly, their condition assessed with the same detachment applied to any other goods moving through a port. What struck Broniewski most was not the noise, but the silence. Many of the captives had stopped speaking, whether from shock, from exhaustion, or from the recognition that no one in that place would understand them if they did. They had gone quiet. That silence was the final stage of the Eurasia process. By the time a woman left Kaffa on a ship heading south across the Black Sea, she carried nothing of what had defined her. Not her name, not her family, not her language, not her legal identity. She was cargo in transit, and the trade network that moved her was old, efficient, and indifferent to the question of who she had been before. The ships fanned out from Kaffa toward Istanbul, toward Egypt, toward the Anatolian coast, and the Balkan interior. And at the far end of each route, a household or an estate was waiting for what had been purchased. A lifetime under the control of a new master. Istanbul in the 16th and 17th centuries had one of the highest concentrations of enslaved people of any city in the world. Steppe origin women fed into that city's domestic economy continuously, into the households of merchants, officials, military men, and at the far end of the wealth spectrum into the imperial palace itself. Mamluk Egypt imported enslaved women for domestic service throughout the same period. Households across the Ottoman Balkans and Anatolia absorbed thousands annually without any record being kept of where those people had come from. What waited at the destination depended almost entirely on who had purchased you. For the majority, it was domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, weaving, childcare, the low-status work that kept prosperous households running. Evliya Çelebi, the Ottoman traveller whose 17th century chronicles documented daily life across the empire in extraordinary detail, described enslaved women in wealthy homes as so normalized a presence that their existence attracted no particular comment from anyone around them. Their labor was expected. Their suffering was not recorded. The legal structure made escape functionally impossible. An enslaved woman in an Ottoman household had no recognized legal personhood outside her owner's authority. She could not file a petition. She could not own anything. If she fled and was recaptured, and urban environments were full of people with financial incentive to return escaped slaves. The punishment was severe, and the attempt itself was legally treated as theft of her owner's property. Some women attempted it regardless. Ottoman court records from the 16th and 17th centuries contained cases of enslaved women who ran, were caught, and appeared before judges. The entries are short. The outcomes are almost uniformly the same. The women are named in the records only in relation to their owners, identified by possession, not by personhood. There were exceptions. A small number of enslaved women from steppe raids rose to positions of genuine consequence inside the households they entered, through proximity to power, through intelligence, through the particular vulnerability of influential men to those who served them most closely. The most documented is Hurrem Sultan, almost certainly of Ruthenian origin, sold through Kaffa and delivered to the Ottoman imperial palace, where she eventually became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, and wielded political influence that shaped Ottoman succession for a generation. But Hurrem Sultan was one woman inside a trade that processed tens of thousands annually. For every woman who found a foothold in the system, there were thousands who disappeared entirely into anonymous labor, undocumented, unremarked, and unremembered. The isolation was not accidental. It was structural. No shared language with the population around her, no knowledge of local geography, no legal standing, no relatives within reach, no money, no past that anyone in her new surroundings recognized as real. Each of those conditions reinforced the others. Together, they made resistance not just dangerous, but conceptually almost out of reach. Some captives held on to private traces of who they had been, prayers in languages their owners didn't recognize, names they kept to themselves even as they answered to different ones. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, the Franciscan friar who traveled through Mongol-controlled territories in the 1240s and left meticulous observations of steppe society, had already noted enslaved women quietly maintaining customs that their captors neither understood nor suppressed because they were too small to see. The trade had changed in form by the 16th century. The interior experience of it had not. And occasionally, the evidence of that interior experience survived. Polish diplomatic correspondence from the mid-17th century contains letters written by or dictated by ransomed captives, women bought back through church-organized ransom funds after years, sometimes decades, of servitude. Their accounts are fragmentary and understated, as if the writers had learned not to ask for sympathy. They describe distance, physical labor, beatings, the difficulty of recovering Polish after years of disuse. Several describe being resold, moved from one owner to another, each transaction resetting whatever small familiarity they had managed to build in their previous household. One detail appears in several of those letters independently: the sense of temporal dislocation. Women